Hello again and welcome to my channel. Today's video it's a bit spontaneous, to be honest, because I was looking through some information on the internet and I saw that cassettes are having a revival. My first reaction was complete and total unbelief, to be honest. There is nothing good about the cassette or cassette decks. Now, before you all start writing to me, please bear with me and let me explain why. As a further spanner to throw into the works, I would suggest that even a low bitrate MP3 file will sound better overall than the best cassette deck on the market, past or present. Let me tell you a little story going back to about 1974-ish. At that time I was in retail and I had my own hi-fi business selling medium to so-called audiophile equipment. On the racks we had things like, at the lower end of the market, the Akai 4000D, which was a reel-to-reel recorder that sold rather well to the mid-market, and at the extreme ends of the scale we had things like the Revox A77, I think that was the number, which sold basically to semi-professionals. One day a rep comes into the shop, can't remember what brand it was, but he came with a cassette deck under his arm, and at that stage they were just new and nobody really had any information other than the fact that they were about to be launched by Philips and their subsidiaries. Anyway, he brought this machine in and said, try this and let me know how many hundreds you want. So we put it on test. He left it with me for a couple of days, and the conclusion was at that stage, how the hell are we going to sell these? Who is going to buy them? Because bearing in mind we were dealing with the sort of medium and upper audiophile person. Now, when I talk about cassette decks generally over this video, I'm not talking about the sort that is portable. I'm talking about the sort of home hi-fi type cassette deck. So just to clarify, because obviously the portable market is a very different market to probably what you and me would regard as hi-fi. We had this in the shop for a couple of days and listened to it, made recordings and actually did a few tests, because in those days we did even have test gear in the shop. And the conclusion was, no one's going to buy this because it didn't sound very good, had lots of hiss, didn't have any HF, and all the things that cassettes are sort of well known for. And when the rep came back, I said to him, he said, how many do you want? And I said, I'll have 2, because I thought there's always some mug that will buy any old crap. Sorry about that, but it's true. Imagine you come into our shop and you say you want a cassette deck. You've seen them advertised, and so on the shelves we've got, we use the Akai 4000DS, not because it's the best reel-to-reel, but because it was a very popular one, and in the UK they sold at a discount price for about £100. The new cassette decks also sold for about that sort of money. So the customer will come in, oh, you've got the latest Magawaki Flopperdob cassette deck. Yep. Can I hear it? All right. You're always reluctant to let people hear things that sound like shit. But that's what he wanted to do. And he said, oh, yeah. Can I show you the Akai 4000 DS? Because it's the same price. To be honest, it wipes the floor with the sound of the cassette deck. And I played it to him, the similar piece of music. He said, yeah, that does sound better. But this one can fit. I can buy a car player and play the cassettes in the car. My son can have a portable player. And you can't argue with that. So he bought the cassette deck. And the rest, shall we say, is almost it is history. From then onwards, cassette decks sold like hotcakes. I hated selling them because, well, I'm going to tell you why. And this is what this video is largely about. I'm going to tell you what's wrong with cassette players, or cassette decks as they were called in those days. And again, I need to verify, we're not talking about the portable that costs £30 or something like that. That is a completely different market, and we didn't sell such things. We sold the so-called hi-fi ones, right up to the Nakamichi, which was ridiculous amount of money. To be fair, did sound pretty fair. Probably not as good, well, not probably, nowhere near as good as the equivalent reel-to-reel, which price-wise would have been the Revox. The difference is the Revox had a spool of tape 10.5 inches or whatever it was in diameter, and the cassette was that big, and you could take it in your car. Let's have a look what's basically wrong with cassette decks. And this is true today. If you're buying a second-hand one, why you'd want to do that, I don't know. And maybe you won't after you listen to me a little bit on this. First of all, the frequency response of a cassette deck. Now, in all my initial comments, we're talking about a brand new deck with brand new clean heads, properly set up with the azimuth and all that. And regretfully, that does not apply to all brand new decks. Some of them were really poorly set up. Azimuth was wrong. And anyway, let's not jump ahead. Now, the claimed frequency response for a cassette deck varied tremendously. Like all things, even today, like power and frequency response of modern amplifiers, the frequency response was grossly exaggerated. First of all, they would quote a certain range, let's say 30 to 16 kilohertz, which was a typical quoted frequency response for the better cassette decks. Some quoted better, some quoted less, but very rarely did they say within 6 dB or 3 dB or whatever. Now, an amplifier, you'd be upset if it was more than a dB or so down from 20 to 20k, and many amplifiers exceed well into the stratosphere. Cassette decks varied tremendously, and they varied for all the following reasons. Firstly, the tape. Now, you would think a particularly expensive tape would be better. Well, again, in theory it would be, but if the bias wasn't set for that high quality tape, it would actually sound worse. For example, if the bias was set for a medium quality tape, or an average tape if you like, if you used a high quality tape, it would often give treble lift. quite considerable amount, 6 or 7 dB of treble lift, which initially you think, oh, that sounds better. This sounds better than the original, which of course is bullshit, because it's like a preamp. It shouldn't make, and it cannot make, the amplifier sound better, in the same way that a tape cannot make the original recording better than the original recording, because if it does, it's adding or subtracting, and in this case it would add considerable treble lift. Okay, so that's one point. Forgetting about the tape, let's assume that this particular cassette deck is, and they specify, which occasionally would be the case but often not, they would say it's a type 1 or type 2 type of tape. But cassettes varied horrendously. For example, European made tapes like AGFA and BASF would need a different bias setting for the same tape from China. Well, in those days it wasn't China, it was Japan. Maxell, TDK and tapes like that, which were largely from Japanese markets. So if you bought a cassette deck made by Philips or one of its derivatives, you were generally better using AGFA or BASF tape. And the same was true, those tapes did not perform well with Japanese, again, no Chinese at that stage. Most of the overseas tape cassette decks were made in Japan. The frequency response, let's assuming we've got the exact right tape, would be generally minus 6 dB from one end to the other. To make it look better, they would say plus or minus 3 dB. So instead of having a flat response and it dropping off 6 dB, because the frequency response of cassettes was very non-linear, it could go up at certain frequencies by 3 dB and go down at other frequencies, which didn't really matter. But it's still a 6 dB variation, which is a lot, to be honest. It's a very wide range, and the frequency response was very far from linear. Here is something which I think a lot of people don't know, even today. When you measure the frequency response of a cassette deck, you generally measure it 20 dB down. So imagine 0 dB would be equivalent to clipping in an amplifier. You'd measure it 20 dB down to actually get the frequency response, and that's where these numbers were given. And that's because tape saturation, let's say you quote 30 to 16K within 6 dB. Well, that is minus 20 dB down. When you record on a cassette or any reel-to-reel medium like that, you want to record as near 0 dB as you can to get the proper signal-to-noise ratio, because again they quote you minus 50 dB signal-to-noise ratio, but that's at 0 dB. And if you go above 0 dB, usually that 0 dB was where the green and the red it was shown on the meters, and you were generally kept the modulation under without going into the red, because that would be classed as 0 dB. But generally you could go plus 3 dB on peaks, and it would sound compressed but not actually distorted. Your frequency response, I've got some graphs to show you here, I'll slot them in here, and you can see on this graph that the frequency response at 0 dB is really crap. I mean, it really is. If you want the best frequency response from a cassette, you need to record at a very low level. But then you can't, because the signal to noise ratio on a cassette is so poor that you always try and record as loud as possible. But that means that high frequencies are not only down in level, but are also highly compressed. And it's one of the reasons why cassettes can sound quite muffled. Let's talk about Dolby B noise reduction. It was regarded as the saviour of the cassette because it could give you potentially between 8 and 10 dB of noise reduction, but only at high frequencies. And it's one of those things that it's up to, not is, but up to. The basic signal to noise ratio of a cassette deck is about 35 dB, minus 35. Adding an extra 10 dB of noise reduction could be the saviour. The biggest problem with the Dolby noise reduction is it is a two-way process, and people didn't understand that. They'd record it without Dolby, and on playback they could hear all this hiss. They flick the Dolby switch and all of a sudden all the HF is 10 dB down. To be fair, so is the noise, but you've got no HF. Dolby is a two-way process, and what it does basically, this is a simplification of it, the lower levels of high frequencies it lifted. This only works at a couple of kilohertz upwards. It doesn't give any noise reduction at the lower frequencies. The issue with Dolby noise reduction is it relies on the same level, because it's a two-way process. If you lift the level, let's take an arbitrary frequency at 5 kilohertz. If you lift that by 10 dB, when you come to play it back, that level must be at the same reference to reduce that and still maintain a flat-ish frequency response. That is all very well and good, providing you make the recording and you then play it back on the same machine with the brand of tape that was specified. Because if, as I said earlier, the tape will give you that lift, or if it was the opposite, give you that cut, when you record it and then play it back, the levels will be different, and so will the amount of noise reduction without affecting the frequency response. But if you was foolish enough, as we all were in those days, you probably have 2 cassette decks, or you'd make cassette decks, and you could make a cassette on your machine and give it to a friend to play it, and it would sound completely different. It could sound very toppy, or the usual case was it would sound muffled. And it was largely, but I'm coming on to other parameters in a minute, due to mistracking of the Dolby noise reduction. The next big issue was tape heads, because when you buy a brand new cassette deck, obviously the head is brand new, it's clean, and it's azimuth. In other words, the way it sits isn't like that or like that. It's hopefully spot on. The first day you get your tape machine home, you plug it in and you set it all up and you think, wow, that sounds good. From the moment you record that tape, the tape head will start to wear. And The effect of a worn tape head is a gradual decrease of HF, high frequencies. And it gets to the point where, now because it happens slowly, you're not conscious of it initially, but gradually it goes down, and then eventually you find that tapes that you've recorded 6 months ago start to sound muffled. And again, it's partly because of wear on the head. Basically the gap gets wider on the head, and the high frequencies just aren't, they're just not picked up. And then couple that to the fact you're probably using Dolby noise reduction, that's not tracking at all well now. So the HF rolls off like a brick. And we used to get customers coming back after just 6 months and saying, oh, my cassette deck sounds awful. And you say, yes. Oh, well, can you fix it? Well, yes. Can I bring it in? Yeah, okay. And you say it's probably going to cost you in those days about £30–40, because all you could do was replace the head, because the heads were made largely of mu metal, which is a relatively soft metal that wears very quickly. Bearing in mind we're talking about minute tolerances here, so a tiniest bit of wear and the HF just goes simple as that. And the customer would say, oh, but it's under warranty, I've only had it 6 months. Yes sir, that's right, but it hasn't got a fault, it's just worn out. And the customers would be horrified that, I mean, to change a tape head properly, I mean, there's plenty of cowboys in business in those days that would change it, and it's a relatively easy job to do. But sometimes you had to dismantle the whole bloody deck. You really did, because of the way that the location of the head, and to get in, move all the electronics out of the way to get to the deck. And then you had to have calibration tapes to set the azimuth properly, although the cowboy would just put a tape in there and twiddle it. Oh yeah, that sounds about right. You can believe me, I could tell you a dozen people that did that. But to do it properly would probably take you about 2 to 3 hours. And labour's not cheap, as you well know. My labour was particularly expensive, mainly because I did it properly. Another problem would be azimuth of the tape head, because most of the time people wouldn't clean their heads with a cotton bud or something like that. They thought the more force you put on it, and so you could really scrub the head, what would happen is the azimuth on most of the cassette decks, the head would have a fixed pillar one end of its mounting, and the other end would have a screw thread, so you could do this to make the head, if you like, go up and down. This would invariably get twiddled by customers. I don't know why, it's one of those things. If there's a screw in there, you've got to be able to make it better if you twiddle it. But without calibration tapes, you can't. And coupled that to dirty heads. Dirty heads was the biggest single problem with cassette decks. People would bring them back in the shop, and if it wasn't worn out, you could look at it under a lens, and sometimes you could see it was covered in oxide, because again, people would buy often very cheap tapes. The problem with very cheap tapes is the oxide would come off very readily, and it was also very abrasive, so the actual tape itself would wear the head. But then the manufacturer started saying, oh, we could put cues in this so people could find certain tracks easily, and the public loved it. So you put play on and rewind or fast forward, and you could hear the music going past like that. All you were hearing largely was the destruction of your tape head, and of course it put more wear on the tape itself, which meant the oxide came off and stuck to the head, and it was a continuous thing that everybody thought, well, this is brilliant, I can find the third track along, but they didn't know they were destroying their basic tape heads. All wasn't completely lost, because Akai and a number of others produced a glass crystal head, which largely alleviated this problem, because the wear on a glass crystal head, they were called various things, but that's basically what they are or were, and those heads would last a long time, and sometimes they would fail because they would crack, and that was the end of the head. And if you had to replace one of those, you really knew it, because they were not cheap by any means, whereas the standard mu metal head was actually quite cheap, because they were mass produced and most of the decks used nearly the same head. A tape needs bias to allow it to record. Most tape decks in the early days in particular had a fixed bias. Add this to the Dolby noise reduction, tape head wear and azimuth, and you had yet another nightmare which could make or break the sound quality of your cassette deck. Now, when the first tapes that came out were classed as normal or type 1 bias, and most cassette decks came out with that kind of tape in mind. So in other words, the bias was set for that kind of tape, because that's all there was. So, and there was a fairly good chance, but again, you still had that difference in bias between European brands and Japanese brands, which most people didn't know at the time. Then different tape formulas started coming out. Type 2, often known as chromium dioxide tapes. Now these tapes needed a very different bias level. So if you use that tape, because it was publicized as being better, so everybody rushed out because they wanted better. Of course they did. And they bought this tape, and with the bias being set for the type 1 tape, you had very different HF. Some of the tapes would give high frequency lift and some would give high frequency cut, because they were all different. And changing tapes was a nightmare. You really had to choose various brands of tape and then stick to it. Now, to make things even more complicated, type 2 tapes needed a different EQ as well. And you often had a switch. In the early cassette decks, it would alter the bias but not the EQ. So again, you had differences, and all these parameters largely affected the high frequencies. The mid to low frequencies were for all intents and purposes much the same. But the different brands or the different types of tape also had different sensitivities. So again, it would record at a higher level. So the Dolby again was out of calibration. If I'm making this sound like a nightmare, it's because it was a nightmare. It really was a nightmare. It was all because people tried to get something out of a cassette which it was never designed for. It was designed for dictation, basically, and it was brilliant for that. But people thought, oh, we can make this hit the hi-fi market. And there's companies like Nakamichi where everything was adjustable, the bias, the EQ, and it was, if you like, a semi-professional machine, but on a cassette. But you're still basically dragging, well, let's put it like this. When you think of a professional reel-to-reel machine, in a studio, it was using often 2-inch tape, but that's to be fair because it was multi-tracked. But if you imagine the original 1/4-inch tape, and with just 2 tracks on that, and it would be running at a minimum of 15 inches per second, and for a master tape it would be running at 30 inches per second. And here you are with a boxy shitty little cassette with 1/8 of an inch of tape with 4 tracks on it running at 1 7/8 inches per second. I mean, the fact that it sounded as good as it did or could do was a miracle, really. But it was only a miracle for about half an hour because it all started to go wrong with head wear, tape wear, and the machine itself wear, because it's all made of bits of plastic all going round and graunching it. Once the mechanism failed, which they did because bits of plastic would break off, flywheels and things like that, it was basically junk. And to sort of sum up this video, answering the question why anyone would want to buy, oh, and just as a slight diversion, pre-recorded tapes were shit. I mean, I cannot use another word that is better than that. They were recorded at high speed on the cheapest and nastiest tape possible. 1 or 2 in the latter years used chrome tape, but again, there's chrome tape and there's chrome tape. None of the duplicators used quality tape. It was always junk tape. And so you bought this stuff, it had Dolby noise reduction on it, which didn't track, and they always sounded muffled, and when you come to measure them, they had no HF. So why would you want to go and buy one? Get an MP3 player, or better still, use FLAC files or something like that, which have no wow and flutter. Frequency response is flat. Distortion is about a 10%, well, lower than the distortion on cassettes. Even at 20 dB down is 3 or 4%. And when you start getting it up near the 0 dB, the HF roll-off and the distortion is just unbelievable. Even an LP record is better than that, and that's pretty dreadful. So please, unless you like punishment and misery, never, never, never buy a second-hand cassette deck and think you're going to refurbish it. There are 1 or 2 people out there that love doing it, and praise be to them. But if you're just an average audiophile that thinks you're going to get good results from a second-hand cassette deck, you're not. You really are not. And please don't do it, because you will regret it. And if the mechanism itself is all falling apart, you might as well throw your money down the drain or send it to me. Sorry this has ended up as a rant, but I think by now you get the idea that I don't and never have liked cassette decks. I have owned 4 or 5 in my lifetime, but they're crap. Thank you so much for watching as usual. It's much appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. Cut. Thank you so much for watching. I forgot. Try again. Thank you so much for watching as usual.